This is the Design Discipline Podcast. My name is Mehmet Aydın Baytaş. Today I'm speaking to Anthony Hobday. Anthony is a user interface designer. He is a self-taught expert on visual design and interaction design. He is also a teacher and explorer in the world of design through his many side projects, including but not limited to more than 50 articles and 6 books. Anthony has created so many of these resources that I believe you can actually dive into his website, which is anthonyhobday.com, as a beginner and emerge after a few weeks of reading as a competent designer, ready to create highly functional user interfaces. In the field of interface design, Anthony is one of the top thinkers in the world today, and in this episode, we look into his world, the world of an expert designer and design thinker. I'm going to ask him about what drove him to acquire such a high level of expertise, the opportunities and costs of being an expert, and his thoughts on the craft and the business of interface design with Anthony Hobday. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I really enjoy discussing design, so any chance I get.
Yeah, and I really enjoy hanging out with fellow design nerds, so it's really a pleasure to have you today. Tell me about your earliest design memory, maybe the moment in your life when you discovered that there is this thing called design, and it is actually a profession. It's something that you can do to make a living.
I'm glad you've asked me this question because I see it in a lot of discussions about design. People talk about when they were, 10 or whatever it is, and they take apart their first, whatever it happens to be, and they learn about, whatever. And my story is almost the complete opposite. I sort of not bumped off, I think that means kill. I bounced off interface design, I think twice in my life. The first time I was at university and I did information systems, which was basically a course, like a curriculum that this one person had come up with at that university to train people to be consultants, because that's what I thought I wanted to be. And there was a module in there that was thrown in, which was, I think, UX design, but it might have been called something else. And so it was only one module out of, 40, however many you do during a UK university course. And we read some books. We definitely read The Inmates Are Running the Asylum by Alan Cooper, which was a book he wrote, I think, before he wrote About Face with the rest of the Cooper team. But I read that and I was in the classes and everything, and I didn't really pay any attention. So I wasn't particularly interested in the idea of designing software then. Fast forward a few years later, and I was living in a different city and doing a different job. And I was trying to think of something I could do with my life. And I thought, oh, maybe I should be designing software, because I guess I knew more about it by that point. And even then, it sort of, as soon as it came into my head, it left my head. Like I considered it briefly and then stopped considering it. And so I only actually really got into design when I joined a company that was making software, and they offered me the chance to design some new features for the software because there was very few employees. And I said yes, and I tried my hand at it for the first time ever, basically. And that was when I was 25. So I came quite late to the world of design. Part of me wishes I had started a bit earlier, because I could have started my learning sort of journey earlier. And then right now I'd be in an even better place. But I definitely don't mind. Since I started in the first place, the fact that I started into design at all, found my passion, is a great thing. So even though I did it when I was 25 rather than 18, for example, I'm still happy. And so, yeah, basically I did that, and I started buying books about UX design. Or that was how I thought about it, UX design at the time. And now I think of it in a different way. But I started buying books, and I read all the books I could get my hands on. I learned as much as I could, and I was getting better. I had many chances to design at that job. And they made me a full-time designer 6 months after I joined, just because I sort of threw myself into it. So I got extremely lucky, sort of discovered it by chance, even though I had dismissed it twice before in my life. And the rest is not really history, because no one's written that down. But now it's history because I've been talking about it on this podcast.
So I shouldn't really be asking like two questions in one, but I'm going to take the risk. because I think you can figure it out. It's actually one question, but it sort of comes in two forms. The first form of the question is, what did design mean to you at that early stage, and what does it mean to you now? And the second form of this question is, which designers did you look up to then, and which designers do you look up to now? And how might you maybe account for the change through the years, if there is any?
This is an interesting one because the longer you spend being a designer, and especially I think the longer you spend thinking about design the way I do, which is very sort of rule-based and trying to break it down, and I'm sort of furiously against the idea that there's any hidden patches of design that shouldn't be uncovered. You know, I really want to break it all apart into small pieces and list all the small pieces. And so the way I thought about design back then, I suppose, was partly frustration that there weren't things that were easy to uncover. They weren't things that people had already written down. I thought it was very big. You know, there's not an endless number, but there's a lot of books you can read. You could easily read triple-digit number of books about just software design and all its sort of related fields.
What year are we talking about now when you mentioned this time?
Yeah, so when I was 25, so I'm 35 now, so 10 years ago, when I started buying books, I basically used one resource called the Monster List of UX Books or something similar, and it's an Airtable list. And I started basically going through that and also other lists that recommend books and buying everything I could. So I was sort of exploring everything because it seemed like such a big world to me. And the way I think about design now is that I've come out of the other side of that, and I'm not, all-knowing. But I'm a lot closer to all-knowing than I was. And so I look at it more as almost a syllabus, like a curriculum. I look at it as a collection of concepts. And now I feel like I've almost mastered design in terms of the concepts that make it up. Or at least I know everything. It's hard to describe. I don't know everything there is to know about design. I know everything there can be to know about design. That's sort of been my goal, even if I haven't dived into some specific topics so much that I'm a master of them. I sort of feel like there's nothing left to unturn.
You sort of know the table of contents, I guess.
Yeah, and that's been a big focus for me, is I'm looking at it now as a table of contents, whereas before it was, that's an interesting topic. I'll pick up a book about typography, that sort of thing. I've come out of the other side of that reading journey, and it feels like a big sort of pile of knowledge. So I think that's the main shift, is that I've started to think of it more as sort of an academic pursuit. And back then I was thinking of it more as I'm doing this day by day. I want to learn more so I can get better at it, get promoted, do this full time. It was more of a practical approach then, and now it's more of a academic approach. Yeah. So back then, I think the designers I looked up to were people like Jared Spool, who wrote the books that I really enjoyed, and made the videos, wrote the articles, but also the person who wrote Don't Make Me Think, Steve Krug. So I was a big fan of Steve Krug's practical approach to writing. I discovered these writers who were sort of quite early on in the world of interface design, and they'd written such great stuff, very practical stuff that I could read and learn from. And it almost feels, Jared Spool's still around, he's still giving talks and things, but it almost feels like some of those writers have faded away and design has shifted. And now the designers I look up to are people who want to sort of continue that journey and write down practical things about design, and who don't want to hide behind this veil of sort of coolness that some designers seem to like to have, that they sort of act like the skills they have are magical, and they want to protect that because maybe it's good for their image to suggest that what they're doing is magic. Now I look up to the people who are willing to break everything down and hopefully write things like articles, that sort of thing. So there's been a shift there as well, as I focus more on the academic side than the sort of practical side, I suppose. It's still practical. I don't want to be considered an academic. Yeah.
I guess we have something in common then, by the way, because I have thought about what makes a really great designer, an outstanding, really, really good designer. And for me, I've kind of identified three things in the people that I look up to. And two of them are really straightforward. I would expect a really good designer to have some degree of commercial success. And I would expect them also to like kind of stand for something, either represent a community or represent an idea or something that they really embody in terms of an abstract idea or ideology or whatever you want to call it. But the third one, I believe, is that they are also teachers, they are writers, they are speakers, they talk about design, they advance not only their own practice, but the whole field by having these conversations and teaching other designers. So that those three things are for me the mark of a really great designer. It's interesting that you also kind of came to the same conclusion.
Yeah, I saw someone recently was talking about the way that they do drop shadows, which is quite a simple thing, but there's so many different approaches you can take. And I think people who are new to design, there's not actually a lot you can read about drop shadows, or there wasn't when I started. It was one of those sort of signs to me that people hadn't talked about certain things enough, especially in visual design. And so this person recently was talking about the way they do drop shadows, and it was on a social network. And they were saying, here's an example of how I do drop shadows. If you want to find out the way I do it, I posted a subscriber-only video where I talk about my method. And that person, I strongly believe that person does not own that method of doing drop shadows, even if they happen to play around with it and discover it and use it every day. I feel like that sort of knowledge belongs to everyone because that's how we learn. And that's how we all become better designers, which benefits the whole world. And so the fact that they were hiding it behind some subscriber paywall it made me quite angry. And I was going back and forth about replying or quoting or something. And eventually I didn't, because I've got these rules about how I engage with people on social media. But yeah, that really bothered me, because when designers want to try and hide that knowledge or keep it back, it's frustrating.
I have mixed feelings about that, though, because like I also, I make this podcast and I make a bunch of other content on the internet, and a lot of it, as you know, ends up like being free work. And I want to ask you about this in like the coming minutes of our conversation, but it's basically, I feel like it's an artifact of like, we haven't really yet figured out how to share knowledge on the internet in a form that also can be kind of compensated, I guess, for the lack of a better word, or I failed to find the right words maybe, but back in the day people used to write books or people used to give lectures, and for these things they were compensated. And now on the internet, the moment you publish anything, it's just copied infinitely and it belongs to everyone. It's sort of, there's no cost to like making copies of things on the internet. So it's a bit of it's a field where we're still kind of discovering, I think, with the creator economy and all of those discussions, we're still trying to figure out like, how can we create knowledge? How can we share? How can we be creative and also get compensated for it? That's technologically and from like a business and technology perspective, from an innovation perspective, it's a field that I'm very excited about. I follow it very closely. I try, experiment with different tools and practices out there. But we're, as humanity, I think we're still figuring it out. We figured out the printing press, and now we can get paid for sharing knowledge in that format years ago. And on the internet, it's still new. It's been only maybe 10 years since we have the technology to do these things properly. So I think it's going to happen.
Yeah. I generally, the way I think about this is that the more effort the creator puts into something, probably the more they can charge, the better I'll feel personally about how much they charge for it. And so I'm always going back and forth in my mind about people who create courses, video courses for design, and then charge potentially thousands of dollars for it. On the one hand, I don't like that knowledge is locked up, because I've always engaged with cheaper knowledge. I would say cheaper because most of it's been from books rather than free. But still, a book, you could spend 10 hours reading a book and it costs you £30 maybe. And so that seems like a great deal to me. But then, yeah, there are people who are making video courses, and it would bother me, except that I know they've put a lot of effort into those courses. And so generally the way I think about it and the way I approach it is that the only reason that my knowledge is free, or I make as much of it as free as possible, is that I keep it as simple to make as possible, because I'm generally quite lazy and I don't want to put lots of effort into how I present something. So I write it up as essentially plain text. maybe with some illustrations, but generally not, if I can avoid it. I share it on a very simple website and I share it for free. But if I was to make a video course, which I have considered many times, I would have to charge money for it because it would suddenly be 30 hours of my time I'd spent on one thing. And maybe the whole approach breaks down at that point. Having said that, I think I would charge as little as possible because I still want that knowledge to be as free as possible.
Let's dive into this a bit more, because in this podcast, I actually want to have kind of a deep conversation with you at the intersection of the craft and the business of design, and also design teaching in the way that you do it, in the form of, one might call it content creation, maybe. So my first question on this is that, as you mentioned, you're creating a lot of open source design knowledge. Your website is home to more than 50 articles. There's 6 books. There's a bunch of interviews, quotes, videos, a lot of resources. I can imagine a design beginner could load up your website. They could consume all of that content and they would emerge as a competent interface designer. They would not be a beginner anymore, having gone through all of that knowledge. It's a lot of open source design knowledge, as you put it. This sounds like a lot of unpaid and potentially thankless work. And you're spending your time on creating these free resources instead of doing professional work, basically. This is hours that you could have spent on getting paid. And I struggle with the same because I produce this podcast and I produce a bunch of other things. So I'm personally very curious. Can you tell me about some of the mechanisms that work to translate this kind of community service or open source work into professional opportunities? Or maybe is that not the case and you purely see it as a charity and purely as a kind of non-profit contribution to the world?
Yeah, so one thing I almost never talk about online, and so people don't know this about me, is that I have a full-time job as a designer. And I recently got a message from someone who said, along the lines of what you're saying, how do you do this? How do you make money from this? And generally I don't, but the reason I don't have to make money from it is that I have a full-time job. And generally, I see it as all of this work benefits me directly because I become a better interface designer. I would be learning these things regardless. And what I make sure to do is that I just write them down. And so one of the benefits I've had is that I've been doing this for 10 years now, basically. If you write things down as you learn them over the course of 10 years, you end up with a huge pile of knowledge as long as you are consuming as much knowledge as I have been, because some people, they just learn on the job. They don't think to write it down. But I've been so obsessed with learning it in a way that is repeatable, as in I can repeat it to someone else, that I can then write those down relatively easily. And so it's essentially that sort of compounding effect where over 10 years, you're going to have written down a lot of stuff. You're going to have filled your brain with a lot of very practical, very repeatable knowledge. That knowledge tends to sort of multiply in the sense that, oh, I can see how these things are linked, whereas before they were just in separate piles. And now I can maybe write a short book or put an article together that describes the link between these things. I'm at the point now where those things are incredibly easy for me to do just because I've already gone through the hard work of sort of gathering all the knowledge. Now it's just connecting the dots. And so the way that it benefits me is that it makes me a better designer. It makes me a more impressive designer, sort of selfishly. And that means I can apply for jobs. I can impress the people who are interviewing me better. And then essentially, like you say, the rest of it is charity in that I'm sharing it with people. I'm not charging for it, but I'm sharing things with them that I learned from other people and that I've had to gather regardless. So it's not necessarily thankless work because I'm thanking myself, or I'm benefiting financially from it from myself. And it also feels really good that people are benefiting from it as well. Especially because when I started this sort of learning journey, people were, as people will be, quite skeptical of the fact that I was just writing down lists of things, But now I've written down lists of almost everything, and suddenly that's a bit more useful. So, I essentially do it in my spare time, but at this point in my career, it's relatively easy to do those things. I'm not having to go and do the research because it's all just bumping around in my head, or I've gotten it written down somewhere. I can just go into my own knowledge base, if you will, to do the research rather than having to get the books and read through them again.
I want to zoom in on something here because, as you said, having created all of these resources, now you have learned all of these things, and now you stand, I guess, indisputably as an expert on interface design because your knowledge is not only learned in your brain, but it's also out there for people to see. Tell me about the particular kinds of work opportunities that become available at this level of expertise. So what really happens when you rise to this level as a professional? Is it easier for you to get design work? Are you paid higher? Do you complete the work faster? From like a purely practical, pragmatic, business-centered perspective, if you were to make the argument for becoming an expert to a designer who's maybe at a more junior level or a mid-level, how would you describe the value of accumulating such an expertise?
Yeah, first of all, getting work. I work full time at startups, so I don't do any freelance work in the traditional sense. But one benefit I noticed is that I've always struggled in interviews to prove that I'm good at visual design. One of the sort of weird quirks of the way I've approached my knowledge is that I learn a lot of the concepts. I don't often put them into practice. Generally, in the past, I've worked at companies that didn't need good visual design, so I didn't really have a lot of reason to put it together. And actually, doing really high-end, like sort of beautiful mock-ups in your spare time is a lot of wasted time for me. I'd rather learn these things and then have to be able to apply them when I need to. And so often in interviews in the past, it's been made clear to me later on, or I've suspected, that they didn't see enough evidence of good visual design, and so they rejected me. And so actually, the way I've approached it is not good in that sense. But my most recent job interview, which was for the job that I have now, they very kindly said to me, which is extremely rare in my experience, they said to me, "We think you're a great fit, but we're not seeing much evidence of visual design. Can you talk more about that?" And that was like a godsend, because in the past, they've just not seen the evidence and they've rejected me outright without telling me that. In this case, they said, "Can you talk more about that?" And I said, "Yes, actually, if you go to my website, you can see I've written a book about visual design. I've also gathered some examples here where I realized that I wasn't showing much evidence of this. And so I've gathered some examples of my visual design just to show you that I do have, the ability." And basically pointing out the things that I've written down about visual design convinced them enough to hire me, even though they were slightly, concerned. And so I think, like you said, writing a book, being able to point to that knowledge in sort of not physical form, but in digital form, is really helpful. Beyond that, writing about these things on formerly Twitter, now X, means that I've gained quite a large following. It's not as large as some designers, but that's just generally because I don't try to grow my followers fast. I just sort of let it happen organically. So it's been a bit of a slow growth, but it's sort of steady. One of the things there is that you gain that large following, suddenly you've got more opportunities. And it bothers me slightly because I tend to stay in jobs for a long time. I haven't really had the opportunity to do that post on Twitter that you sometimes see where people say, "I'm looking for a new job," and see how much opportunity comes their way just from that sort of following they have. But I certainly have a better chance now that people know me and follow me on Twitter or X than I did before of getting more work if I happen to leave this job, although I am happy in my current job. I'd say the final thing is that I started a paid feedback service where if companies want to, they can pay me and get unlimited emails for a month. And I'll basically send them feedback on their work. And so that's a relatively easy thing for me to do, a relatively quick thing for me to do in my spare time, mainly because actually writing a list of detailed bullet points is extremely fun for me, extremely easy for me because I have the knowledge all ready to go. And it means I don't need to do a lot of production work. I can write a text email in, 5-10 minutes, where if you had to do a video review, it might take you half an hour to an hour. So that work suits me as a full-time designer and lets me earn a bit of extra money just because I'm living off that expertise. Companies hopefully recognize that I can give them valuable feedback on their work, and I can do it quickly.
So you mentioned in your words that there was a lack of visual design in your portfolio previously, and you use your writings and sort of teaching material, the content, to argue for your expertise. But what I see when I look at your work, especially on your website, is that it seems like you favor this kind of minimalist and more timeless style of building interfaces. And in particular, your website, it looks like something that could be from 20 years ago, and it will probably survive in the same design. It will just live on and be usable in the next 20 years also. I get the feeling that you really believe in this, that good design is as little design as possible, as Dieter Rams put it. On the other hand, there are designers out there doing extremely detailed and impressive visual work in web design. I see a lot of 3D graphics, animations, very fancy like scroll transitions, things that look and feel like computer games, and really large 3D worlds. These are possible today on the web, and a lot of designers are taking advantage of them. They're doing really, really beautiful work, and they're getting paid very well, some of them, as far as I know, for doing that stuff. Tell me about this decision to focus on the timeless instead of the impressive. In particular, can you tell me again from a pragmatic and practical perspective about the businesses that you work with, the products that you design, where the classic, the timeless, the minimalist style actually makes sense, and how your clients might be different from a business perspective, from the people that build these like high-tech animated 3D kind of artifacts?
Yeah. I should say up front that one of the reasons that my website is so simple and that I prefer simple design is that it's easier to build. So for me personally, I write my website in HTML and CSS, so it's all static. I upload it with FTP. I don't use any sort of what you consider modern technologies to release that. And so people who are building their portfolios in Webflow or Framer or any other modern tooling, they might even find it harder to avoid those flashy animations just because those tools sort of push you towards that. But I've always been a little bit obsessed with simplicity. And that was one of my first focuses as a designer who was learning about, different perspectives, was what's the simple perspective, or what's the benefit of simplicity in design? And so I just have a sort of a personal interest in that in general. And so that leads me to have strong opinions when it comes to design that I fully control. But I appreciate that I don't fully control all of the things I work on. And so the companies I've worked for, I would say that when they're hiring, they want someone who's good at visual design. But actually, when you get down to the job, they don't need someone who's good at visual design, which has always been a frustrating sort of mix to have, because you've got to get through the interview, prove that you know good visual design. And then when you get there, you're working on a relatively boring SaaS application. And that's not a bad thing, because some applications need to be boring. You can't have a really flashy SaaS application because, like Dieter Rams believed, if you live with something every day, you want it to be quite plain because you have to look at it every day. If it's always sort of grabbing your attention out the corner of your eye, you get really tired of it. Or if you're, trying to read something in front of your beautiful, chaotic rug, it sort of distracts you from what you're reading. And so actually, I believe that your environment should be relatively simple, especially if you're using them every day. And because I work on these SaaS applications, it turns out that simpler design is better. And so I think things like less color, so that color can be used in only the most intentional way. Maybe less density, maybe more density, but as long as you have everything clear, simple design helps with those things so that you can use that SaaS application more easily, so that you can understand it more easily at a glance. And so simplicity suits those situations. And it's not as extreme as the simplicity I show on my website. But just having that concept of simplicity in your mind and not believing that the flashiest design is the best at all times means I think you'll get along better with the sorts of companies that hire the majority of designers. I did a poll recently because I realized I didn't know what the people who follow me on social media are actually designing every day. And the majority of them are designing desktop SaaS applications, which is the area where visual design is the least important, essentially, or the area where you don't need to use as much visual design if you can count visual design. So that helped me realize that I'm talking about flashy websites all day because those are the things that are easier to talk about, when actually maybe I should be talking about the simpler visual design, because that's what people are actually being asked to build every day. And probably the less people we have building those tools that believe that everything should be animated, the better. So maybe in some ways I'm taking sort of a counterweight position where I'm trying to balance out the people who are focused on the really flashy, the heavy end, and focus on the less flashy, the light end.
That's a perfect segue into something I wanted to get into, because we've spoken enough about like the business side of things, I guess, and I want to kind of nerd out on the more craft side of things, which I know you're very, very interested in. What's one thing in interface design that's very obvious and very simple to elevate a design, but frequently overlooked by most designers, in your opinion? For me, I would say this is line width. It's very difficult for the human eye to read lines of text that are, let's say, like longer than 10 words or a dozen words. And you can fix this very easily in design and front-end development, but most people just don't care. And actually, some of the worst offenders on the internet are some of the most popular websites. Wikipedia is the absolute, the guilty, the worst party. Hacker News is another one. They have these long comments. Email clients, the Apple Mail client, Gmail, they're also very bad at this. The lines are just completely out of control. But to me, that's the mark of a very competent designer, to have your line width under control. That's like a checkbox you kind of have to tick as a designer. Give us one tip like this, something very simple that we can use to elevate our designs everywhere.
Yeah, so the first one that comes to mind is to only use denotive color. And what I mean by that is that often people use colors for connotation. So they're saying they add something because it's a more exciting color. They're trying to highlight something. Or maybe the color, relates to your brand in some way. Especially for application interfaces, I would suggest that you don't use any color to start with, and then only introduce colors when you find a reason for one. And so a very obvious reason is that anything that's interactive, let's say, should be a dark blue, and everything else should be black and white. One of the best things about that is that essentially no one else is willing to do it. So it appears very brave, even though it's much simpler. And when you do it, people always find it impactful. They always find it interesting to look at. So you have a purely black and white, I think cal.com does this quite well. If you have a purely black and white interface, and then you add only one color to highlight interactive elements, I think you'll immediately impress a lot of people just because it's so striking. But on top of that, it's so usability friendly because suddenly people only have to look for that one color and they know exactly what it means. And so that's what I mean by denotive. That color means something that's been sort of assigned a meaning in your interface. You're not relying on the cultural meaning. You're saying blue means interactive. That's it. One thing I will say, and I'd have a similar comment about your line width suggestion, is that it can be quite difficult to hold yourself back in that way. So even though it's a simple concept, as a designer, you want to be expressive often. You want to explore all these different crazy ideas. And actually holding yourself back so that you only use one color and only use it for interactive elements is actually extremely hard for a designer to contain themselves in that way because they've got so many possibilities. And I'd say something similar about line length, because I agree with you that line length is a very easy way to make all text more readable. But actually, if you try that in an interface, suddenly you start sweating because you've shrunk the line length and you've got these big gaps either side of the text. Like on Wikipedia, I'm sure they tried it. And maybe they really started having arguments internally because, now we've got these huge gaps either side of Wikipedia. That looks awful. But it only looks awful because it's so different. And so it's actually very difficult to restrain yourself in that way. And so I think that's why people don't do it. So if you're able to use these simple concepts and stick with them, be bold, be courageous, then you'll often find that suddenly you're the talk of the town just because you're doing something that no one else is willing to do or doesn't seem willing to do.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Restraint is one of the hallmarks of a great designer, or the hallmarks of taste. I give this example frequently, but I have this friend who is very known for his sense of fashion and sense of style, and he only wears black. In fact, he has a very, very small wardrobe. I've seen him, he has like 3 pairs of shoes and, 3 pants and, that sort of very small and all black. And he's known to be a very, very stylish, very fashionable person. And you would imagine, thinking of a fashionable person, that they would have a large wardrobe and they would follow the trends and so on. But this guy just doesn't care. He just has his own little thing and he sticks to it and he's known for it. And it's the same way in interface design, graphic design, and all kinds of other design disciplines. I think great design is about saying no to all of the things that are outside of your design vision. And that's how you maintain a striking design, as you put it. And I really like that you mentioned cal.com, which I also use. And I switched to it recently from one of its competitors because it has really, really great design. Especially, it appeals to me very much in the dark mode. I don't even know if it has a light mode, but it's like completely black and super, super, super minimalist. So I use it for everything now. Tell me about a piece of software that you prefer over the competition, because the interface is very, very well designed.
Maybe 5 years ago, I started using Things, the to-do list app. Yeah. And I think it's designed by a relatively small team, and they basically haven't changed it. I think in the entire time I've been using it, they've made one sort of noticeable change, which was to add simple markdown support to the sort of notes you can add to each to-do list item. And so they're very opinionated about what things should be. And when I say things, I mean capital T things, not things in general. So you can't share your to-do list with someone else, that sort of thing, that they sort of keep the feature list pared back. And I really appreciate that, because I think a lot more software should be well designed and then they should stop, which basically never happens in software, I think mainly because of the commercial realities. But I think there are cases where you could build something once, make it essentially perfectly designed, stop changing it, except for the fact that you maybe update it to suit new platforms. And so you see that with old games on mobile phones, for example. Often someone will release a really good game and they won't update it because they don't need to update it. You know, it's good as it is. But then it doesn't support newer resolutions or newer screen sizes as they get updated. And that's always a shame. And so I use Things every day. I use it to track my personal to-dos. I use it to track my work to-dos. Well, I used to. Now I work on a issue tracking software, and so that tracks my to-dos for me. I don't need to use Things anymore. But basically for me, it's perfect. And the fact that I can't share those to-dos with someone doesn't matter to me. I was happy to pay for it full price on my computer. I was happy to pay for it full price on my iPhone. I hope they can stay alive as a company forever. But I think even if they can't, maybe it won't matter, because maybe they'll just switch the syncing engine to iCloud if it's not already, and maybe it'll be self-sufficient. And so that's something I really appreciate. And the main reason is because they've put so much care into the details of a relatively simple app that it just feels good to use. And there aren't many apps like that stick around, which is a shame, because they either change and become more complicated, or they can't stay alive commercially and they have to close down. This ties into the previous point we were talking about, actually, in that one of the best ways to stand out in almost anything is what the marketers say is zigging while others are zagging. So basically you're doing the opposite of whatever's popular. And I think with things like software, and as we were talking about before with sort of visual styles, it's so tempting to go big or to go complicated, to go chaotic, add more stuff, that basically it will always be striking and stand out if you stay simple or keep it basic or keep it small, because you're essentially zigging against human nature. And human nature is obviously very hard to deny, but it's not, I don't think it's as if the software industry in 10 years' time will suddenly be lots of simple, small apps. I think they'll all still be growing as fast as they can and eventually dying because they're too big. And so it's always going to be an advantage in some ways to stay small or to stay simple, even though it's hard to resist the alternative and probably hard to stay alive if you are depending on continued income.
I gave this example in the workshop that I was doing with startup founders recently, where I asked them, and there was like maybe 10 people in the room. I asked them, do you prefer light mode or dark mode? And one of them said dark mode. So I said, okay, if you imagine there's like 10 million potential users for whatever you're building, and all of your competitors are doing light mode, you can basically just grab 10% of that market only by replicating the same thing, the exact same functionality, but different style. You just do it in dark mode. And that one person multiplied by a million will be your customer, and you will have a healthy business. So as you said, there's these niches of the software industry where by making a design change, just by standing out with your UI design in a particular way, you can really grab a piece of the market. You will not maybe dominate it. You will not, destroy all of your competition, but you will have a healthy business because the numbers can be so big. And even a small part of some of those software markets, you can really differentiate yourself with interface design and have a healthy business in that manner. But we've been talking a lot about software. Obviously, we are both software designers, but I'm very interested in the design of physical objects also. Can you tell me about an object that you've purchased more than once because it's so well designed?
Does it have to be the same exact object? Like iPhones, obviously I've purchased more than one, but they're different each time.
I guess, yeah. Let's go with the same.
Yeah, so, one that's right in front of me is my monitor. I found a good sort of well-designed monitor. It's 27 inches. It was a bit more expensive than I guess I was usually willing to pay, but I thought my job is looking at a screen all day. I should have a good monitor. And actually, I bought this before sort of 4K or high-resolution screens were really popular. So it's still not sort of 4K or 5K or whatever, but I bought it, and then one day I broke it. I knocked something over, and it knocked my monitor over, and my monitor hit my keyboard and put a big dent in the screen, and it was broken immediately. And I immediately bought another one because I didn't want to go and buy a cheaper monitor. So I think monitors are relatively boring in terms of why people like them, but it's got thin bezels, and it's 27 inches. It's an IPS screen, so it's sort of sharp, good colors. One of the reasons I like it, though, is that it's got physical buttons. And one thing that really annoys me about physical products is that they have sort of haptic touch buttons. And that's a strange thing to say when we use touch interfaces every day, on our phones, and we design for them often. But when things can have physical buttons, and especially when those buttons are hidden out of sight, like they are on my monitor, they're underneath the sort of bottom edge, having to feel around when you can't feel anything really frustrates me. And so I specifically looked for a monitor that had lots of inputs and physical buttons, which is a hard combination to find. So I immediately bought the same one because it's worked for me. And I like the fact that it's got physical buttons, which seems like such a small thing, but it just feels good to have that sort of reassurance there. I know this is a big topic in the world of car design, automotive design, because a lot of manufacturers are moving their physical buttons to a touchscreen. And that's causing, security, or not security, it's causing health, not risks. Health and safety.
Safety, yeah.
Safety, yeah. I was thinking health risks, but not, well, yes, it is health risks, but safety risks, where people are trying to change the seat temperature and they have to look away from the road because you can't sort of physically memorize where the seat temperature button is on a touchscreen because it changes. It's the same with induction stovetops in the kitchen. A lot of them have this very flat surface, and they want a flat surface because it's easy to clean and it looks cooler when it's off. It's like a flat sheet of glass. But then they have these induction buttons or these capacitive buttons, and those aren't fun to use because they've got this impossible to understand interface where you press one button by accident and suddenly the number changes to T or something, some random letter, and it turns out that's the overboil setting that boils your water in 3 seconds, and you didn't mean to use that because you wanted a gentle boil. And so they've tried to simplify in the wrong way, and they've made it look simple but not work simple. And so that sort of thing bothers me. And recently we had to buy an induction stovetop, and they didn't even offer a version that had physical buttons that I could, turn to 6 or whatever, the way that everyone's used to. So it's that sort of thing where I actually want my physical objects to be as simple and as untechnical as possible, even though I work on software every day. And so I really value that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think the price is maybe the most decisive factor in why things are becoming that way. Physical buttons are much more expensive than touch screens if you multiply them by the number that they put in cars or stovetops and things like that, whereas the touch surfaces end up being much cheaper to manufacture. So and also they can basically, even though they are cheaper to make, they can sell it at a premium because it's supposed to be a high tech and modern and advanced design, I guess.
Yeah.
I once actually got locked out of my stove. That was really funny because I have exactly the same kind of stove that you mentioned. It's like touch buttons and completely flat surface and everything. And I touched something accidentally and it got locked. It has like a child lock or something like that. And I have no idea how to unlock it. There's like completely unlabeled symbols, buttons on it. I didn't know. Or I had to find the manual for the stovetop on the internet, Googling different models of it and read up on how to unlock it. Basically, it was really annoying.
I've experienced something similar myself. I think some of them have a sort of automatic cutoff if you spill water on the touch controls. I think maybe it doesn't want them to trigger on their own because of the water. I'm not sure how the touch controls work, whether they're actually electrical sort of signals or what. But basically, this pot overboiled, which you can expect to happen on a stove sometimes, right? The water comes over the edge. They should have really planned around this. But the water got to the controls and suddenly you couldn't use them. It went into some shutdown mode. And so we had to wait for 10 minutes until this stove unlocked itself. And when you're trying to cook dinner, that's absolutely ridiculous. So it's that sort of thing where you can't figure out how it works just by looking at it. That really bothers me. I know that one way to solve that is that you put a touchscreen, like a proper touchscreen, into a stove, which I hope doesn't happen. I hope we go back to physical controls, but it might take some teething issues before people are willing to commit to it.
So we are approaching the end of the time that we scheduled together. I just want to ask you something I asked basically everyone, which is book recommendations.
This is always a struggle for me because I'm not trying to boast, but I've read a lot of books about design just because early on I was buying everything I could get my hands on. I was reading them nonstop. And so it's very hard for me to recommend books, especially now, because a lot of the recommendations I have were from the perspective of my career at the beginning. And so I generally recommend books that really helped me to get a quick grasp, like Don't Make Me Think by Steve Krug, which I've already mentioned, just because they're shorter and they're practical and they're easy to read if you want to get a sense of whether you're interested in design. Some of the books people recommend are quite long and quite heavy to get through. They're quite academic. And I don't really enjoy that because they were a bit of a struggle for me, even though I was reading as much as I could to get through. They didn't really make me feel that design was fun, which it is. I really enjoy designing. And so I think reading about it should also be enjoyable. So I'd recommend Don't Make Me Think by Steve Krug. I'd also recommend... Okay, I have a copy here, I think. This is the one book I own a physical copy of about design, which is Designing Visual Interfaces by Kevin Mullett and Daryl, I think it's Sano, it might be Sano, I'm not sure. This is, I think, the best book that's been written about visual design because, first of all, there aren't many books about visual design. And second of all, they took an extremely practical approach to it where they basically broke down all the concepts, wrote them all out very clearly. They structured them all very clearly. You can just read through the table of contents and see what they're talking about. It's not all got these hard to understand section titles that are a bit fluffy and sort of magical sounding. They've basically broken down visual design into these principles. And so even though the examples in the book are all from the sort of Windows 95 and before era, probably this was written or released just as Windows 95 was coming out. So a lot of the examples are even older. The principles they're talking about are timeless because they're not talking about visual style. They're talking about how you should do things like layout, how things should relate to each other. And those things are always useful. So I definitely recommend that because it's a good sort of comprehensive deep dive into an area that most people don't dive deep into.
I feel like one of the problems of visual design, why people maybe don't share and use and accumulate that knowledge so much, is that you actually don't need too many people who know it because you can encapsulate it, you can embed it in the tools that we use to design. So you can take a lot of the visual design practices, embed it into something like a UI kit or a website builder or a front-end framework, and then it's ready to use by anyone who doesn't know visual design. As I said, teach startup founders on how to do their designs. And one of the first things I tell them is that you actually don't need a designer if it's your first time, building the first prototype of your product. If you have a developer, which most of them do, then you can just make a napkin sketch, hand it to your front-end developer or full-stack developer or whatever that person is called, and they can use one of the most popular UI frameworks or coding, front-end packages to just build out the user interface in a very usable and very, good-looking form. And later they can involve a designer to put some polish on it, advance it, take it to the next level, whatever you want to call it. But you can in this day and age especially, you can put a lot of that into the digital tools that we use. I guess back in the day it was a little different. If we go 50 years back or 100 years back, the tools that graphic designers used to use were very manual. They used to cut things out of acetate or cardboard or paper or different tools. Like if you go to a graphic design museum, you can see this. Actually, you can see the physical labor that has gone into producing various posters and various designs from the classic mid-century designs, etc., that we like to look at. So that's something that's very interesting to me. Like, you just don't need so many people who have that expertise. Just a few people who have it and embed it into the tools seems to be enough for most purposes. But of course, there's people like you and I who really just enjoy it, and we keep nerding out on it anyway.
One thing I find interesting there, which we touched on before, is that even though you don't need it practically, because I agree with you, it's not necessary, especially these days, for a lot of designers. If you're trying to get a job, you still need to prove that you can do it, and so that's this weird situation where hopefully more company owners realize they don't need a really strong visual designer because they can use a pre-built kit, like you're saying, especially for the first year or two. But when they interview someone, they still want to see something impressive. People are still impressed by visual design, good visual design. And so even if it's not something you'll actually do in your job, it's still a way you can get the job in the first place, which is, it's an unfortunate situation, but I think people should be aware that it's a situation that's real, because they can hopefully use that cynically to their advantage, put together some good visual design, use it to get a job, and then never do it again, essentially.
Tell me about something that you learned recently, like one of your most recent design learnings.
This is a hard one. I think a lot of them feel like discoveries, in the sense that I am working through something and a way to describe a principle I've run into will surface in my mind. And so if you're happy with that sort of thing, I just posted about it today, actually. I realized there's a principle that I had not captured in my sort of list of interaction design concepts before, which was that the more general purpose a feature or a tool in your application interface is, the more you have to be, the less you can be decisive about how it should behave. And that's quite vague and hard to understand. But essentially, if you've got something like a search tool where someone could use it for any number of purposes, maybe they're searching to find something they found before, maybe they're searching to see if something exists, but you've got this very general purpose search tool that they can do all of those things with. It's hard to decide then, when they click on the result, this exact thing should happen. You have to be a lot more flexible in how they use the tool, just because they're using it for a lot more, purposes. And so one of our jobs as designers is to decide how these things should act. And we sort of really want to come up with something very specific and complete that feels neat. And we should say, when they click on a result, it should do this one thing, But actually, when the tool is general purpose, like an overall search, global search in your app or something, you sort of need to provide some flexibility, or you need to be opinionated and decide to exclude these use cases and accept these use cases. And so the more general something is, you might think the easier it is to design, but actually it's the harder to design. And the more specific, the more focused something is, the easier it is to design, because it's much easier to decide how it should behave when people interact with it, because generally those people are only using it for one thing. If they're using it for 10 different things, suddenly your job is 10 times harder, because you've got to figure out, in this case, it should do this, but in this case, it should do that. And those two things are in conflict. And so, like I say, that's not something I necessarily learned. I suppose I already knew it somewhere in the back of my head, but it's something today that I sort of bumped up against and thought, I've bumped up against this more than once already. And so now I need to write this down, because I've realized it's a general principle that can be used again and that I should be aware of again. And so I suppose I learned it just by sort of trying to design something. I haven't actually read many design books recently. So I've been sort of taking a break and reading fiction. So I can't tell you something I learned recently from a book, which is how I usually learn things.
Any particular fiction that you've been reading that was really good?
Well, related to design, I've actually been working my way through Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, specifically because a big part of the book is about philosophy of quality. And I'm really fascinated by the idea of quality, what makes something good, especially interfaces. how can an interface designer be a good interface designer? How can they produce good interface? And so I had heard that Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance was about the general concept of quality, and I was interested to read a sort of more approachable take on that subject. Just because it's fiction, they have to be a bit more approachable than someone who writes a book about, quality from an academic perspective, which I've tried to read as well. Books on aesthetics, and they're sometimes quite hard to follow just because they get into the technicalities very quickly. So that's some fiction I've been reading. Apart from that, it's generally science fiction or fantasy. I like to sort of take a break from learning about design with something completely different.
That's really cool. I guess these are things that you continuously write about on the internet. Where should we find you and follow these ideas?
So I'm on previously Twitter, currently X. And my handle is Hobday Design, which is Hobday Design. I won't spell that one. Hopefully people who are listening to this already know. And the link to my website is in my bio there. So if people want to go and see that, then they can feel free.
So finally, before we conclude, is there a question that I should have asked you before we are done? Perhaps a question about design that only you and the world can answer?
A lot of the opinions I have about design that I enjoy the most are very cynical. And so I would have really enjoyed it if you'd asked me a question that could have let me go on a complete rant about a cynical rant about the nature of design. But I'm quite glad you didn't, because people often don't like thinking of design in a cynical way. So, but having said that, maybe a question you could have asked was something like, what are some cynical truths about design that people could, understand, but not necessarily share that they understand them, that would help them in their career? Because I think there's a lot sort of bubbling under the surface, and I think the way that design works, people often aren't willing to talk about or share those because they don't want to think of design as a cynical, sort of practical thing that you learn. They want to think of it as this magical, we're creating new things, we're helping people to have a better experience with life, which is not always the case. I think you can get ahead if you have a more cynical worldview as well.
I don't know if I quite picture what it means for design to be cynical. What does that, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so one thing I often think about is that probably if you gave lots of designers some sort of truth serum, which made them tell the truth, the technical, practical truth, and forget all of the emotional side of things, and you said to them, what are some things you do when you're designing something visually to make it more appealing? I think they'd have quite a lot of very cynical sounding methods they use, visual styles they use. Like maybe they say, oh, we put this blue blurry thing in the background because it just makes it more visually interesting. And that's quite a cynical reason to put a blue blurry thing in the background. Hopefully the blue blurry thing is sort of related to your brand and really represents your mission as a company and your purpose on this earth. But very few people have a purpose that relates to blue blurry things. And so really the reason it's there is because it just adds some visual interest, right? And that's an extremely practical thing to do. I would often advise it if you have quite a simple website and you want to make it look a bit more designed, then you can just add some quite cynical visual touches that will make it feel more interesting to look at, just because that will draw people in. Those are, I think, valid reasons to do those things, but designers are often not willing to admit that they did it for that reason. And so often when I ask designers, oh, why did you do this? I can sort of see them struggling to come up with a reason that sounds good. And really, I know the reason they did it, and I want them to just say it out loud, but they don't want to say it out loud because it sounds like they're not taking design seriously in some way. And so there's lots of that sort of thing where there's little tips and tricks you can learn that will help you be a better designer overnight that often designers aren't willing to admit will help that much.
I struggle with this, because I like designing super minimal things, and I've had these discussions with clients before when I make a website or an interface, and it just looks kind of empty in a way. And they're like, oh, it looks really empty. It's like, where's all the design? And I'm like, why should there be any design? It does what it's supposed to do. You have, the text, or you have the function there, and it works. And they're kind of always expecting something more. And I think in a way we're almost wired these days. We're habituated. We're kind of used to seeing things with a lot of detail, a lot of interesting, touches. So that's kind of become what people expect from designers. The fancy background graphics and the blur effects and the animations and things. And few designers, and even fewer of their clients stop and think about, like, okay, what is the purpose of this thing, and does it fulfill the purpose? Does it not fulfill the purpose? Versus just looking at it and saying, okay, how was the vibe?
Yeah, they're definitely vibe focused, and they're sort of seeing it with their feelings, and they want to feel better immediately when they see it. And I'm happy to admit that in the past I've sort of realized that if you add an icon to something and use more dividers or borders on things, it tends to look more visually designed. And so sometimes I do that just because I think the thing I'm designing right now will look a bit plain when I show it to people. So I'm going to add an icon and I'm going to add some dividers, and it'll look like I've done more work essentially. And I'm not trying to prove to them that I'm working harder or something. I'm trying to show them, I'm trying to get them to be more impressed with my work essentially. And so those sorts of things, you can do them just to give the right impression. And it's relatively divorced from the idea that you're doing it for a practical or valid or useful purpose. You're doing it, I mean, it's still useful to make people impressed with your work, definitely. But when you're doing it purely to impress people, you start to see the cynical side of design. And those are the things that I really enjoy thinking about, but that few people enjoy talking about, which is what really interests me about interface design, I think, at the moment.
I guess kind of a counterpoint to that, to conclude with, might be that, the job of a designer in a way sometimes is to create a vibe, even in the interface design. Like, of course, the functionality is one of the primary things that we strive to get right. But then we are presenting this as a product for consumers, and consumers do expect a kind of vibe, and they do prefer certain products that speak to them in the language of the vibe over other products that they don't. So I think about that often these days, and more I find myself gravitating towards creating designs that have those elements, those, as you said, the cynical elements that kind of play with human psychology. They play with the way that we see and the way we perceive colors and the way we perceive different visual effects. And to me, if you had asked me, what have you learned recently about design? I would say that is where I'm spending most of my time learning these days. I'm learning about color theory. I'm learning about aesthetics. Did you know that on the internet there are libraries of what they call aesthetics, and you can browse like keywords, for example, new brutalism, cyberpunk, techno, utopianism, whatever, these kinds of aesthetics that have certain kinds of materials, certain finishes, certain colors, certain light effects inside of them. You can go on various websites and browse indexes of these. So if you want to design something that looks like it came from this particular subculture in the 80s, you can find these reference libraries for how to do that. And they have these reference visuals, and you can replicate those effects. And that is a big part of consumer psychology that we, in a way, should connect with, because if we don't do that as designers, who else is going to do that? The engineers are not going to do that. The marketers do kind of do it. But I feel like that's a very interesting part of design. The cynical part, to me, is extremely interesting these days, and I love reading about it and learning about it.
And I guess what bothers me about it and why it interests me so much is that these people are willing to be cynical, but they're not willing to admit to it. And I think we should all be willing to be cynical, but we should also be willing to admit to it. I think you'd find it a hard time getting a designer to say, I wanted it to look like it was from the 80s. They would have a longer and more impressive sounding sort of justification for why they were choosing that sort of style, when actually probably they went to an aesthetics library or Pinterest or something and typed in 80s and just started copying down ideas. I think that's completely valid. I think more designers should do it, because you're generally going to end up with a more cohesive visual style in the first place. But I also wish that they would admit to it. I think more designers should admit to their direct inspirations and not try to act as if they did it for this really meaningful purpose if they didn't. I think some of the best designs in the world did things because they thought about it from first principles. I think that's an extremely great way to approach design. But also there's some great designs that aren't maybe as good, but they're still good, where they've just taken direct inspiration from other places. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think we all copy each other. And but I think they should admit to it. I don't think it should be sort of hidden behind sort of meaningless justifications.
Absolutely. Well, Anthony, we are at the end of the time that we scheduled together, and I have to get on with some household responsibilities. I'm sure you are too. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for coming. I hope we can do this again. Thank you very much.